Thank you so much. It's an honor for me to be here in this building to address this honorable auditorium. I've been asked to make a presentation on some features which are important for the Orthodox tradition, and this is the feature of monasticism, of monastic tradition. The topic of the presentation is Eastern Christian monasticism, history and ideals. And I'd like to start with the pre-Christian premises of the monastic tradition. I wouldn't go very far into the centuries, but and into many various Near East traditions, and we'll focus on the Judaic tradition, the tradition of the Bible, which was used also for explaining the Christian monasticism, why it became possible. The Christian hermeneutics of what is monasticism goes back to the Old Testament and to several institutions of the Testament, among which is the institution of Nazarenes, which is mentioned, for instance, in Numbers 6:121. Nazarenes is a word, a Hebrew word, which means dedicated to God. They normally gave vows either temporarily or for good to abstain from drinking wine, shaving, and touching dead. Some ritual things which constituted the primarily the so to say primitive forms of self-restraint and what would be called monasticism in the Christian era. And the most famous Nazarene probably ever was St. John the Baptist. Here you see a depiction of him by El Greco. In the late Judaism, there was a number of sects that practiced various forms of self-restraint. And among those sects, I'd like to stress the so-called Essenes, who flourished from the 2nd century before Christ to the 1st century of our era. Here you see probably it was the place where Essenes lived. They practiced communal life dedicated to ascetics, voluntary poverty, daily baptisms, and abstinence from worldly pleasures, including marriage. So we see a more advanced form of self-restraint. It wasn't just about rituals, just about forms of, rite, like ablutions, like selection of food, but it also went deeper into a more ascetic approach to marriages, to more essential features of human life. In the New Testament era, the archetype of monastic life is regarded as Christ himself. At least again in the hermeneutics of monastic life, Christ is regarded as the source of monastic traditions and the archetype of, as the first monk, if you wish. He believed to articulate himself the ideals which became the ideals of the monastic life. For instance, Christ invited to celibacy those to whom it has been given. He also instructed to sell all earthly possessions in favor of the poor and to follow himself, Christ himself. These features, these instructions of Christ became foundations of the Christian monasticism. However, in the times of Christ, in the times after Christ, even after apostles, in the very early Christian era, monasticism was not institutionalized as an establishment. the features of what would be monasticism later on were practiced by primitive Christian communities. For instance, we know from the Acts that early Christians shared their properties, which would become an essential, a very important feature of institutionalized monasticism. Also, in the early Christian era, we find practices of abstaining from marriages. Christians were advised not to marry in Paul's epistle to Corinthians. Of course, those suggestions, those advices were connected with the eschatological expectations of the early Christian communities. They expected Christ to come very soon, in some years. So there wasn't sense to get married, to take care of possessions. Christians were really expecting the parousia of Christ, and this invigorated the focal points. These expectations define the focal points of what would become monasticism later on. And again, abstinence from marriage was one of them, and we find a number of virgins, so-called virgins, who refused to marry, and by the law of that time were heavily punished by their parents or by their environment, up to the point of being murdered, as it was the case with St. Barbara or St. Catherine. St. Catherine is depicted on this picture, actually. And there were many other cases. Actually, the behavior of these Christian virgins was against the social law, social rules of the time. It was antisocial, so we would say now, and they were punished sometimes quite severely. Summarizing, we can say that in the early Christian church, particular features of what would be monasticism were practiced in many communities by ordinary people. It wasn't a possession. Monastic features were not a possession of a narrow circle of dedicated people. They were spread throughout the communities, throughout the church, and they were regarded as normal features of Christian life. The situation changed with the legalization of Christianity in the early 4th century, when Constantine, the emperor, signed in Milan an edict which legalized Christianity. Christianity became very soon an official religion, and it faced a dilemma of being faithful to the instructions of the apostles, to the traditions which already had been formed by the 4th century in the Christian communities, the tradition which included restraints from possessing goods, properties, features like abstaining from marriages, features like devotion to the prayer, to the liturgy, and so forth. Because of great influx of the imperial officials, social groups of the Roman Empire of the time into the church, the traditions, the rules, the features of the Christian communities of the time before Constantine became challenged, and not all the Christians found themselves in peace with these challenges. And some of the Christians, in persuasion, in trying to keep the old features, the features of the old, for them, old Christian tradition, maybe 1 century or 2 centuries old. For them it was too old, for us it is not, of course. They, in trying to keep these features, they started seeking for refuges, for, if you wish, ghettos, where they could find peace, where they could practice Christianity as they are accustomed to. They wanted perfect life, and in persuasion of this perfect life, they left their communities, larger communities, which became extremely large as for them, and fled to desert. In the desert, there were already some Christians living some perfect style of life. They were already hermits who abandoned communities in order to dedicate all their lives to serving God. Especially those hermits or this refuge to desert occurred in Egypt. Largely, it was this tendency, trend to go to desert was inspired by non-Christian traditions, non-Christian practices that existed even before Christianity was planted in Alexandria and in Egypt. And Christians took those patterns of behavior from the non-Christian hermits and used them for themselves, so that a number of hermits went to desert, established themselves in the desert. And when Christianity became legalized and Christians started seeking for some perfect life patterns, they found them in desert, and they found already people whom they could imitate. Probably the first recorded Christian hermit was St. Paul of Thebes, who lived in mostly in the second part of the 3rd century, first part of the 4th century. He didn't go to desert because he wanted to escape a community which became, in our terms, more secularized, Christian community which became more secular, something that we face probably in our churches. Nowadays, the same problem was faced by the Christian church in the 4th century. It wasn't the tendency to secularization which forced those Christians like Paul of Thebes to go to desert. It was exactly seeking for perfect life and also following the patterns of other hermits, non-Christian hermits, who tended to abandon communities and to live in isolation. And those Christians who started going to desert before church became merged with the state, became patterns for the Christians who were forced to the desert by the state, by the tendency of secularization in the beginning of the 4th century. Here on the icon, it's a Coptic icon, you see exactly the figure of Paul of Thebes. I'd like to say a few words about this personality. According to Jerome's Vita Patrum, as a young man, Paul fled to Theban desert during the persecution of Decius and Valerianus in the mid-3rd century. He lived in the mountains of the desert, in a cave near a clear spring and a palm tree, the leaves of which provided him with raiment, and the fruit of which provided him with his only source of food, till he was 43 years old. And according to the legend, a raven started bringing him bread to feed him. So it's this raven is depicted here on the icon. And so he lived in the desert for more until the age of around 100 years, quite a long life. Another leader of early monasticism was Saint Anthony, called the Great. He was another person who left his community, his Christian community, for the desert, not because of the secularization of the Christian community, but because he looked for a perfect life. His life and teaching, very fortunately, were thoroughly recorded by Saint Athanasius of Alexandria, who, through this life of Saint Anthony, became one of the first theoricists of the monastic lifestyle. According to the information provided by Athanasius, Anthony was born in Lower Egypt, and the words that urged him to abandon his community and to go to desert were the words of the gospel that says that if you want to be perfect, go sell what you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasures in heaven, and come follow me. So Anthony was stricken by these words. He sold his property. He wasn't extremely wealthy person, or his parents, but he was more or less, he was prosperous. The family was kind of middle-class family, and he sold everything he had and left for desert. Interesting is his lifestyle in the desert. He used to live in many places, like a tomb, an abandoned Roman fort, a cave, etc. He moved from one deserted place to another, from one peculiar place to a more peculiar place. He didn't retrieve himself from the life of the Christian community. He kept in touch with the Christians of the neighborhood. In particular, he took some part in the life of the community during the persecutions, when he himself wanted to become a martyr, something he didn't succeed. During the Arian controversy, he supported with his authority the case of Nicene Council, and the Nicene Bishop of Alexandria, Athanasius, and his authority played an important role in preserving Nicene orthodoxy in Egypt, in Alexandria, and helped Athanasius also to have popular support. Athanasius had big problems with the state, with the emperor, but his real force, his real power was popular support of his flock. And greatly this support was inspired by Anthony, who was regarded as kind of spiritual leader by the Christians of Alexandria. Athanasius describes how Anthony went through different temptations and struggles, and probably for the first time we meet a detailed report of the internal struggles of a hermit, of a monk. Here on this picture of Goya, you see an illustration, a pattern which became extremely popular in the Western art to depict Anthony's struggles against different kind of demons, of spirits. And we find a good number of interpretations of these struggles in the Western art, and this is one of them. So this topic of struggles of St. Anthony with demon became very important for the Western art in the same sense his descriptions, Athanasius' actual descriptions of these struggles became important for the posterior monastic traditions. They became a pattern to follow, to understand, to comprehend the difficulties of the monastic life in the Eastern Christian tradition. Anthony attracted a good number of disciples from local Egyptian communities, and soon around him a whole community was organized, which attracted people who looked for perfect life. These communities were growing through the 4th century, first half of the 4th century, and in the mid of the century they reached the number of 5,000 people. They were spread in, actually separated in different bodies, different communities, mostly spread in the proximity of Alexandria, Nitria, and Skid. The features of lifestyle in those communities were depriving themselves of food, sleep, and any bodily comfort. In most cases, monks lived on their own without being organized into communities and groups. Such an organization into groups became possible with the participation of St. Pachomius the Great, who is considered to be the founder of the cenobitic or communal monastic life. So initially monks were mostly hermits, and now with St. Pachomius they started organizing into communities, and monasticism turned to be communal lifestyle, not isolated lifestyle. Pachomius also articulated the principles of communal life in his rules. The rules of St. Pachomius became fundamental for posterior rules of monastic communal life. From Egypt, monastic lifestyle spread to other parts of the Roman Empire of the time, in particular to Palestine. And in Palestine, monastic life was planted already as a communal lifestyle. And a key person in Palestine, who is considered to be a founder of monasticism there, was Hilarion the Great. He was actually famous for his fasting. And here you can see his diet through his lifestyle. In the age of 20 to 23, he had just half a pint of lentils moistened with cold water a day. Then, in the period of time from 23 to 27, he had only dry bread with salt and water. In the age of 27 to 30, he ate only wild herbs and roots. From 31 to 35, he had only 6 ounces of barley bread and boiled vegetables without oil. In the age of 35 to 63, he had only 6 ounces of barley bread and boiled vegetable with oil as well. Yeah, and in his very old age, he had 6 ounces of water, boiled vegetables with oil, and a broth made from flour and crushed herbs taken after sunset. Rather severe diet. Monasticism also spread to Syria, and among the key figures in the Syrian monastic communities were Saint Simeon the Stylite, who lived mostly in the first half of the 5th century. He, for 37 years, dwelt on a small platform on top of a pillar near Aleppo in Syria. Actually, this lifestyle became very popular in Syria, and still we find now remnants of styles, of pillars on which monks used to live, maybe not so successfully as always as Saint Simeon. Saint Simeon became a pattern, a kind of figure to refer to. Here you see a depiction of how he lived. This is a pillar, this is a platform on top of it, and he actually used food and water, which he elevated to his pillar from the bottom. He also counseled a lot of people who approached the pillar. He communicated with them, by voice. They asked his counsel, and he answered. This was the way how he communicated, and he became an extremely popular figure in Syria of the time. In their majority, the desert fathers were illiterate. Not all of them, or maybe just a minority of them, were really Greek-speaking or originally Greek fathers, especially in Egypt. Majority of them were local people, like Saint Anthony himself, who was apparently of Coptic origin, and probably he was not, as scholars believe, he was not literate himself. So the majority of the monks were illiterate. Nevertheless, they produced a good deal of literature. Most of this literature were so-called apophthegmata, the sayings, the narratives. They were very good storytellers. And those stories were recorded by their disciples who were literate into Greek, and those written stories were brought together into collections of stories, and collections of stories in Greek, of those stories in Greek, are called apophthegmata. Those stories are very edifying, very short, edifying, sometimes very funny, and they were to instruct Christians how to behave in a proper Christian style, way. I've picked up some short stories from those apophthegmata so that you could have an idea of what they were. One of the stories says that the archbishop came to Scetis one day, probably it was Archbishop of Alexandria, and the brethren who were assembled say to Abba Pambo, a big authority among the monks of the time, say something to the archbishop so that he may be edified. And the old man said to them, if he is not edified by my silence, he will not be edified by my speech. Now, they are quite, Roman style, sometimes Stoic style, sometimes funny style stories, which were comprehensible by everyone, regardless of what education, of what philosophical school, if you wish, they were. Another nice story is about Saint Anthony, who once saw in a vision all the snares of the evil one, or that the evil one spread over the whole earth. When he looked upon them and considered their innumerable multitude, he sighed and said within himself, who is able to pass safely through such a world as this? Then he heard a voice which answered him, the humble man alone can pass safely through, O Anthony. In no way can the proud do so. This story became very important for the posterior tradition of humbleness of the monks, and it is gladly retold by the generations of monks. Another story, the third one, just to complete number three, is about Abbot Nisteros, who one day, walking in the desert with one of his disciples, saw a serpent in their path. And they both turned and fled from the serpent. Then the disciple said, "My father, were you afraid?" The old man answered him, "I was not afraid, my son, but it was better for me that I should flee before the serpent. If I had not at once fled from it, I should afterwards have had to flee before the spirit of vainglory." So you see, it focuses exactly the main on the main virtues of monasticism as they were regarded by the monks at the time, which was humbleness, fight against vainglory, about selfishness, and so forth. A part of apophthegmat, a part of those collections of narratives, the ancient writers produced a number of lives, so-called lives, which are actually biographies of the monks, which are very similar to the biographies of great philosophers in the pre-Christian era. So the monks were regarded as philosophers to be followed, whose lifestyle to be followed by Christians, and those biographies were not just, our bios as we know them, a description of life, how they lived, but they were edifying, they were to instruct people. And among those biographies, most known are already mentioned Life of St. Anthony by Athanasius of Alexandria, also Losaic History by Palladius of Galatia, which was written at the request of Lausus, Chamberlain at the court of the Byzantine Emperor Theodosius II. The third famous text of the time was Pratum Spirituale, or Spiritual Meadow, by John Mascus, which was written in the end of the 6th, beginning of the 7th century. Monastic lifestyle started attracting also educated people who contributed their education, their theoretical work to systematizing monastic experiences. And among those people was the most famous one, probably was Evagrius Ponticus, who lived in the second half of the 4th century. He was born to a Christian family in Pontus, in Asia the Minor. And when he was in Constantinople, he had a life full of pleasures, as he is described. And at some stage, he realized that he had to change his life, and he fled to Jerusalem. He stayed for a short period of time in a monastery near Jerusalem. Then he fell ill and moved to Egypt. He first joined the community in Nitria in Egypt. Then he moved to Keli, and he spent altogether 14 years pursuing studies under Macarius the Great and Macarius of Alexandria. He is famous for producing a systematical record of sins, passions, and virtues that juxtaposed to the passions. He has defined 4 generic tempting thoughts, logismi, that contain within themselves every tempting thought. First is that of gluttony, then sexual immorality, then love of money, sadness, anger, akidia. Akidia is better to translate carelessness, right? Vainglory and pride, like mortal sins, but they were not sins for Pontius, for Evagrius of Pontus. He actually made a distinction between categories which would become important for the monastic and spiritual writings and traditions of the posterior time. He made a distinction between thoughts, sins, and passions. thoughts are something which a person, which is an initial stage of immersing a person into the sin, into the bad lifestyle. The thoughts are those things that attract people to wrongdoings. Then people do wrong things after they've been attracted by thoughts, and after they do wrong things systematically, often those thoughts turn into passions, an intention which possesses a person, so that person can hardly resist intention which has already been formed in his soul. Evagrius identified 5 stages of interaction between a person and thoughts. This is a description of the way of a person from a thought to the passion. First is assault, when the logismi, the thoughts, attack a person's mind. Then it is an interaction, when a person opens up a dialogue with the logismi. Then the consent, when a person consents to do what the logismi urge him to do. Defeat is when a person becomes a hostage to the logismi and finds them more difficult to resist. And eventually it's passion or obsession, when the logismi become an entrenched reality within the nous of the mind, the soul of the person. So we, in Evagrius, we find an attempt to systematize, to put in a systematic way the experiences, monastic experiences of the Egyptian desert. We also find other attempts to provide monastic experiences with theoretical basement, in particular the theological basement, and such attempts were undertaken by the Cappadocian fathers. For instance, St. Basil, who is depicted on this icon, composed rules for communities, for monastic communities, which he found in Cappadocia. And still, if you go to Cappadocia, you find remnants of huge monastic cities established as early as by Basil in the 4th century. You really see how big those communities were, though the cities which are preserved now, the remnants of them, are quite later than the 4th century. They are on the same place where they were established by Basil. Another Cappadocian, Gregory of Nazianzus, developed a concept of an ideal theologian, the monastic ideal which was persuaded by Egyptian fathers and by monks elsewhere. And the third Cappadocian, famous Cappadocian Gregory of Nyssa, wrote on virginity, on vision of God, on perfection, and other things that somehow formalized, somehow put to theoretical shapes the experiences, the ideals that the monks felt, not always realized, but maybe felt, and the fathers gave a concrete, a clear theological shape to those ideals. Another example of systematization of the monastic experiences is the so-called Ladder, a book of Ladder, composed by a writer of the 7th century, St. John of Climacus, or of Ladder. Climax is a Greek word which means a ladder. This book comprises both practical recommendations and theological grounding for spiritual development of a person. In this book, spiritual life is presented as steps of a ladder that leads to the heaven. These steps start with rejection of the world, and they end up with achieving faith, hope, and love, the main Christian virtues. So we see that monastic goals were not different from the common Christian goals. They were the same. Monastic life was not persuading some different goals and purposes from a life of ordinary Christian. It was only the way, the path through which monks had to do in their own way. And it was the path of self-deprivation, of self-constraint. And this path was regarded to be the shortest one to the three main Christian virtues: faith, hope, and love. In the monastic tradition, we also find strong features of what we would call now metaphysics. When monastic life demonstrated, or monks demonstrated, that they had really some very profound experiences which were coherent with theoretical thoughts, philosophical thoughts, if you wish. And there was a nice mixture of very internal, inner, profound personal experiences combined with theoretical, philosophical, if you wish, elaboration of them. It was a nice synthesis, if you wish, of philosophy and personal, mystical, if you wish, experiences, though I think mystical is not a very good word for that, but nevertheless it can be used. This synthesis was done by the monks who were well educated, who had a very good philosophical background, especially Neoplatonic background, and they produced some very profound insights into both philosophical matters and into the matters of spiritual life. Among those authors are the writer of the Corpus Areopagiticum, the so-called pseudo Dionysius the Areopagite, a person who lived in the 5th century, probably in the Syrian environment, and who took the name of the judge in Athens, Dionysius the Areopagite, who was converted by Paul. But of course, this person who wrote this book was not Dionysius Areopagite himself, but he was another unknown person. And another person who wrote in the same line was Maximus the Confessor, one of the most probably known philosopher and spiritual writer from the Orthodox Christian, Eastern Christian background. A part of being writers and inciters in metaphysical matters, the monks became protectors of faith. Of course, there were some crises connected with monasticism, like the crisis of monophysitism, so-called monophysitism, which emerged in Constantinople, but spread in the territories heavily influenced by the monastic traditions like Egypt and Syria. Theoretical constructions of monophysitism, teaching about submission and somehow even elimination of human nature of Christ to the Godhead, to his divine nature. This theoretical construction found fruitful soil in the monastic lands, because monks were sometimes despising the bodily realities, the demands of the body, of the flesh. They were fighting the flesh, fighting the bodily pleasures and desires, sometimes to the extent of despising body, if you wish, human body. And they projected their experiences to Christ's body and were happy, some of them, not all of them, but some of them, many of them, happy to undermine the human nature of Christ. So there was somehow monastic support for the monophysitic movement, and there were periods of crisis for monasticism in terms of doctrine, when monasticism somehow supported the doctrines which were rejected by the church. But there were also periods of rehabilitation, if you wish, of monasticism, and especially this period of rehabilitation was the period of iconoclasm, when monks played a crucial role in restoring veneration of icons. Among those monks, most famous was, probably one of the most famous was St. John of Damascus, and the abbot of the Studious monastery in Constantinople, St. Theodore the Studite. The Studite monastery became one of the most prominent in the Middle Byzantine period. Here you see some ruins of that monastery in Constantinople, in Istanbul. When I was there last time, there was a family living just on the court of the monastery, of what remained from the monastery, and you had, just to pay fee, bribe them actually to go to see the ruins, and the only thing you saw were ruins. Once upon a time, it used to be a huge complex, a very important monastic center, now it's just misery. Theodore of Studite produced a code of rules, a typicon which has become standard for all Orthodox monasteries since then. And in this typicon, Theodore put emphasis on cenobite communal life, manual labor, and carefully defined administrative hierarchy. Another important figure of monastic life of that period, maybe a bit later period, was St. Simeon, the new theologian who became famous for his experience of divine light in particular. He also composed a number of hymns, both mystical, theologically rich hymns, that reflected exactly his life experience of divine, communication with God. And in person of Saint Simeon, we find an important focus of monastic tradition, the focus on personal relations between a human person and God. It became far before the Reformation, which stressed exactly this kind of personal relationship between God and person without any mediator. Simeon was one of the greatest promoters of this kind of personal relationship between God and human soul. And this is the hymn one of his many hymns that stress this kind of personal experience and relation. I will read it out. Maybe you can't see all these lines. The fire rises in me and lights up my heart like the sun, like the golden disk, opening, expanding, radiant, yes, a flame. I say again, I don't know what to say. I'd fall silent if only I could, but this marvel makes my heart leap. It leaves me open-mouthed like a fool, urging me to summon words from my silence. So a very profound spiritual experience, which again got a solid theological basis later on in the so-called hesychastic tradition. This tradition, the name hesychastic tradition, derives from the Greek word hesychia, which means silence. Its core features are core feature is ceaseless prayer, the so-called Jesus prayer, which is standard form is, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy upon me, the sinner. And this prayer is performed in a special manner. This manner of performing this prayer became well elaborated and commonly spread in the 13th, 14th centuries especially. It's it's a kind of prayer when a person sits on a stool and in this position prays, trying to observe his heart, his state of his mind, and constantly repeating this Jesus prayer. The theological basis ground for this belief of, for this perception of Jesus' prayer, which became spread in the hesychastic movement, was based on the uncreated divine light, that people, monks, are capable of receiving divine light, receiving vision of God, not of His essence, but of His light, of His energy, of His action in the human heart. And there was a strong belief which was dogmatized in the Eastern tradition that this light is uncreated and it is God Himself. A key figure, a key theologian in this hesychast movement was St. Gregory Palamas, who lived on Mount Athos and who absorbed the experiences of Mount Athos and then shaped them in theological wordings and statements. So the hesychastic movement was born on Mount Athos, which has become since then the most prominent center of the Orthodox monasticism and remains such until now. First monks appeared at Mount Athos in the 8th century. Then there was a boost of monastic life with St. Athanasius the Athonite, who found in the middle of the 10th century Great Lavra, still the largest and most important monastery among the 20 monasteries existing now. Of course, the number of the monasteries changed through the centuries, and now we have only 20 of them. And still the monastic tradition, Byzantine monastic tradition, is flourishing there. There you see a few pictures of the monasteries from Mount Athos, really marvelous pictures and very impressive buildings. One can imagine, can't imagine how those buildings were built at the time without, cranes, without devices like the monastery like Simonopetra, really impressive one. Also, still there are traditional lifestyles on Mount Athos, and one is highly advised to visit them. Well, only men, because females are not allowed to that Mount Athos still. And it is traditionally prohibited for females to enter this monastic republic. A few words about monastic life in the Slavic world, monastic tradition in the Slavic world. The newly baptized Slavic countries became very keen on monastic traditions. For instance, in Bulgaria, from the very beginning of Christianity in Bulgaria, it adopted Christianity, it adopted monasticism, and a number of monasteries were established. Monasticism in Bulgaria is connected with the Mount Athos, and actually monasticism in the entire Slavic world is connected with Mount Athos, which at that time was a place number one to go for monastic traditions. Bulgarian monasticism is connected also with the names of two disciples of St. Gregory of Sinai, a monk who lived in Mount Sinai and who lived also in Mount Athos. Those disciples were Theodosi and Evtimi, who lived in Tarnovo. In Serbia, the main figure of monastic life of the church and in general of the church was St. Sava. Still now, Serbians call themselves Savoslavije, kind of. They have adopted a kind of identity which is intrinsically connected with the name of Saint Sava, who himself was a monk on Mount Athos and who shaped the entire church life in Serbia. In the Kievan Rus, the person who founded monasticism of the Athonite type was Saint Anthony, who founded the Lover of Caves. He actually and his disciples digged caves in Kiev. You can still see them when you go there in Kiev. Nowadays they're just in the center of the city. At the time they were on the outskirts of the capital of the country of the time. And here is the picture from the caves, from within the caves. In the Muscovite Rus, the most prominent monk was Saint Sergius of Radonish, who founded the Holy Trinity Monastery nearby Moscow. And through his disciples, monastic life spread throughout Russia of the time. Interesting was the history of monasticism after the fall of Byzantium. In the Ottoman Empire, there was a decline in monastic life for obvious reasons. Turks did not allow monasteries to flourish. Monasteries were suffocated by taxes. Many of them actually were closed down because of the taxation system of the Turkish Empire. And actually, under the conditions of Turkish rule, to be a Christian or to remain a Christian was a privilege of rich persons and institutions. Only rich could survive as Christians. Others had to convert into Islam because exactly of the taxation system. And still now in the Middle East, the Christians are kind of upper class people because they traditionally were rich, and owing to their riches, they managed to remain Christians because they had enough money to pay taxes to remain Christians. So the monasteries, the similar situation was with the monasteries, when only rich monasteries really could survive because they could afford to pay taxes. And in the mid-18th century, an interesting movement emerged, which was called the movement of Kolivadi. I don't want to go into details because I don't have much time to talk on this. I'd like to say only that this movement has produced a key book of the late monastic tradition, which is called Philokalia. I think Father Andrew will tell more about this book in the afternoon. I just want to say that this is a collection of writings on fathers of the church on spiritual life, and this collection was produced by St. Macarius of Corinth and edited then by Nicodemus the Hagiorite, the key figures of the Kalivadic movement. And this collection is actually a collection of different stories and not narratives exactly, but edification texts, edifying texts ascribed to various fathers. Not necessarily that they belong to the ancient fathers, but at least they are ascribed to them. Philokalia became extremely popular on the Slavic soil, and the person who transmitted Philokalia to the Slavic world was St. Paisius Velichkovsky, who himself stayed for a long time on Mount Athos, and then he moved to Moldavia and translated the book into Slavonic. A key and very beloved person of the late monastic tradition became Saint Seraphim of Sarov. Philokalia actually played an important role in his monastic formation, and he became a life embodiment of that book. He is famous for spending 1,000 successive nights on a rock in continuous prayer with his arms raised to the sky. He actually spent nights on this big rock in the middle of the forest, and he had a smaller rock in his cell where he prayed in the daytime. He liked to repeat, and this is one of his most famous saying probably, acquire a peaceful spirit and thousands around you will be saved. A nice phrase for all sorts of Christian activism, and it's a good instruction for all Christians regardless of their confession. He's also famous for identifying the purpose of the Christian life as acquiring the Holy Spirit. Also famous became the starets of Optina, the elders of Optina. They also were influenced by Philokalia, and we see Philokalia as really a kind of a seed that brought many fruits in different parts of the world. Starets of Optina is a monastery which is located nearby Kaluga in central Russia. Among the elders of Optina, most famous were Moses, Anthony, Leonid, Macarius, Hilarion, Ambrose, and Anatole. Here on the picture you see the portrait of Ambrosius. Optina largely influenced the Russian culture of the 19th century. It was visited by Dostoevsky, Zhukovsky, Gogol, Turgenev, Tolstoy. Starets Ambrosi became a prototype of Father Zosima in Dostoevsky's novel The Brothers Karamazov. Also, the Slavophile movement was largely influenced by Optina. In the 20th century, a very beloved person and embodiment of the monastic tradition became Saint Silouan the Athonite, whose life is very well described by Father Sophrony Sakharov, the founder of the monastery Orthodox monastery in Essex in Britain. Monasticism continues to develop as an alive tradition, and it is estimated that the number of modern Orthodox monasteries in the world exceeds 1,500. There are still saint monks who can be regarded as embodiment of the monastic ideals. In Greek world, they are Paisius, the Hagiorite, Porphyrius, Joseph of Matopedi, Cleopa from Mount Athos, Jan Christiankin from Russia, who lived recently and died recently. And just a few final pictures. This is Father Paisi. This is Father Porphyry. This is Father Jan Christiankin. And this is Father Ephraim. Oops, sorry. This is Father Ephraim just a few hours after he died. You see his smile. And here is a short list of resources. You can find more on the net about monasticism and some books for further reading. Thank you very much.